your remark, and I know there's a reference to it as well in your testimony, but that TARP has failed, and it has failed in part because of the failure to put any conditions on how the money has been distributed. And you talk about the counterfactual. If we had taken $700 billion and simply infused it in a new institution, how the world would look a little different right now. If you make the point about imposing conditions on extending TARP funds, can you just elaborate on that, Dr. Stieglets? What would be your top 3 recommendations?
Yeah, I listed into my testimony a number of recommendations. Obviously, there's broad consensus that the notion of our pouring money into these banks and having the money pour out in the form of dividends, in the form of bonuses, the form of acquisition of other healthy banks, does not lead to more lending. And so that would be an obvious condition. A second set of conditions are that there are a large number of practices that we've identified, everybody's identified as having contributed to the problem. Bad incentive structures, bad lending practices, exploitive, anti-competitive practices in credit markets, predatory lending. We are now, in effect, partial owner of the banking system of these large banks, and yet we're like a slumlord. We're condoning by providing money and allowing the banks to continue some of these very bad consumer and investor practices. A third thing I would do picks up on what the commissioner said. We have some banks that are in better shape than others. These are the banks that actually were spending more of their time actually lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, community banks, many of whom are regulated by the states. They should have been the ones getting a disproportionate share of the money, not the banks that have proven their incompetency and gambling propensities. Moreover, they prided themselves of having moved out of the storage business and the lending business into the moving business. We've been subsidizing the moving industry. We should have been in focusing on lending and asking, what is it? What parts of this sector are necessary? Will get credit restored? And finally, obviously, doing something about the foreclosures.
That's very valuable. Thank you. I want to ask, and I'll spread this across people if you have different thoughts, to talk about the massive failure in the credit rating agencies that gave us the AAA ratings to instruments with enormously high risk. These private credit rating agencies that the government simply embraced and gave legal consequences to that. Can you speak to structurally how we might alter that, how we might think about a different way to do this? Did I see you shake your head no, President Seligman?
No, I didn't mean to shake my head no, but what I will suggest, you have a Hobson's choice at the moment. You either are going to have credit ratings paid for by users or providers. We have a system where credit ratings at the moment are paid for by providers. It creates a conflict of interest. It does create a situation where the oversight until very recently has not been as systematic as it should be. You now have the SEC engaged in an almost frantic catch-up effort with a significant report recently and some proposals which will be considered in important consequences in the next administration. The choices that are also on the table that you may want to think about, one has been the notion of the SEC to place less reliance on credit ratings. And before we go there, we have to think through very carefully what happens then. That will mean more reliance, in effect, on those who provide information to the marketplace and not having any outside evaluation. Second, the notion of the government being engaged in credit rating strikes me as not a thoughtful or appropriate one for the same reasons that we rejected merit regulation in the 1930s in the securities industry.
Dr. Stieglets, could you add on this?
Yes, I think that it is a very difficult problem, that the current system is flawed not only in the incentives that it provides, that underlies the way the credit rating agencies works, but they were also very much taken up with the same flawed models that the banks were using, and so it was partly their incentives, it was partly their analytic frameworks. I think there needs to be diversity, and we in other areas like the FDA rely on governments to rate products to see whether they are safe enough, medical products to safe enough to be used, and circumstances under which they can be used. It seems to me that that analogy is appropriate for financial products as well.
Thank you very much. We're on time here. Congressman Hensarling?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Schiller, your book on the subprime solution is one of 6 presently sitting on my desk. Haven't read it yet. Look forward to reading it. At least you made a few bucks off of me. I think I heard in your testimony, I think you said that you advocate federal subsidies of financial literacy, and I certainly share your enthusiasm for the broader subject of promoting financial literacy within our country. I probably prefer the incentive structure as opposed to the subsidy structure. But I ask the question, as there are various policy proposals pending within Congress that some would argue would essentially bail out a huge universe of borrowers who may not have known about the mortgage products that they signed up for. Maybe they should have known. But what incentive do they have to become financially literate if we essentially absolve them of personal responsibility?
Well, I think